Greta Hoffman pressed her back against the cold cellar wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Above her, she could hear the rumble of tanks and the heavy boots of soldiers marching through her small German town. May 1945. The war was over, and the Americans had arrived. But these weren't just any Americans. Through the crack in the cellar door, she saw them. Black soldiers. The very ones the Nazi propaganda had warned her about for years. Monsters, they called them. Savages who would destroy everything in their path. Greta clutched little Anna closer, the 8-year-old orphan trembling in her arms. This is it, she thought. This is how we die. But what happened next would shatter everything she thought she knew. The small town of Heidelberg had been reduced to rubble. Buildings that once stood proud now lay in heaps of broken concrete and twisted metal. The air still smelled of smoke and ash, a constant reminder of the bombing raids that had torn through the city. Greta had survived it all. She survived the bombs, the hunger, the cold winters with no heat. She survived the news that her husband, Johann, had been killed on the Eastern Front 3 years ago. But now, hiding in this damp cellar with a handful of other terrified women and children, she wondered if her luck had finally run out. Frau Müller, an elderly woman who lived next door, whispered prayers under her breath. Her wrinkled hands clutched a small cross. Her eyes squeezed shut. She had lost her son in the war, too. 2 years ago at Stalingrad. The Nazi propaganda machine had told them all the same thing. If Germany lost the war, terrible things would happen, especially from the black soldiers. They were painted as beasts, subhuman creatures who knew nothing of mercy or civilization. Greta had seen the posters, heard the radio broadcasts. She didn't want to believe it, but after years of repetition, the fear had seeped into her bones. The footsteps grew louder. They were coming down the street, going house to house. Greta heard shouting in English, a language she barely understood. Then silence. A knock on the cellar door. 3 firm raps that echoed through the small space like thunder. Everyone froze. Little Anna buried her face in Greta's shoulder. Another knock, more insistent this time. Then a voice, deep but somehow gentle. Can anyone hear me? We're American soldiers. We're here to help. You're safe now. Greta's German ear struggled to pick out the words, but she understood enough. Help. Safe. Could it be true? Or was this a trick? She looked at Frau Müller, whose face had gone pale. The old woman shook her head violently, silently begging Greta not to open the door. But they had no choice. If the soldiers wanted to come in, a wooden cellar door wouldn't stop them. With trembling hands, Greta slowly pushed the door open. Sunlight streamed in, blinding her for a moment. When her eyes adjusted, she saw him, a tall black soldier in an American uniform, his helmet slightly tilted back, revealing kind brown eyes. He held no weapon in his hands. Instead, he carried a canvas bag over his shoulder. Behind him stood another soldier, younger, also black, watching the street carefully. The first soldier smiled, a warm expression that seemed completely out of place in this war-torn world. My name is Sergeant Marcus Williams. This is Corporal Thomas Jackson. We're with the United States Army. The war is over. You don't need to be afraid anymore. Greta stared at him, unable to move. This was one of the monsters she'd been warned about. He spoke softly, respectfully. His uniform was clean and pressed despite the chaos around them, and his eyes held no malice, no cruelty, just concern. Marcus seemed to understand her hesitation. He slowly reached into his bag and pulled out several tin cans, food rations, then chocolate bars. He held them out to her. For you and the children. You must be hungry. Greta's hand shook as she reached out and took the offerings. When was the last time she'd seen chocolate? 2 years? 3? Little Anna's eyes went wide at the sight of it. Marcus knelt down to the child's level, his massive frame somehow non-threatening as he smiled at her. What's your name, little one? Anna didn't understand English, but she understood kindness. She whispered her name in German. Marcus repeated it, his pronunciation rough but earnest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small chocolate bar, holding it out to her. Anna looked up at Greta for permission. Greta, still in shock, nodded slowly. The little girl took the chocolate with both hands as if it were made of gold. Thomas Jackson, the younger corporal, scanned the cellar and saw the other women huddled in the darkness. He called down to them in careful, slow English. It's okay. Come out. Nobody's going to hurt you. We have food and medical supplies. If anyone is injured, we can help." One by one, the women emerged from the cellar, blinking in the daylight like creatures who'd been underground for years. In a way, they had been. Underground in fear, in propaganda, in a war that had consumed everything. Frau Müller was the last to come out, her face still skeptical, her body rigid with suspicion. She looked Marcus up and down, her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus noticed her discomfort but didn't react with anger. Instead, he spoke to Thomas in English. "She's scared. They all are. Can't blame them after what they've been told about us." Thomas nodded, his expression more guarded than Marcus's. The younger soldier had less patience for this situation. He'd grown up in Detroit, had a good education, and had enlisted thinking he'd be fighting for freedom and democracy. Instead, he'd spent most of the war dealing with racism from his own fellow American soldiers. White troops who wouldn't eat in the same mess halls, who wouldn't share bunkers with black soldiers. And now here he was, liberating people who'd been taught to see him as subhuman by the Nazis while his own country treated him the same way. The irony wasn't lost on him, but Marcus had a different perspective. He was from Alabama, from the Deep South, where segregation was a way of life. He'd picked cotton as a boy, had been called every slur imaginable, had seen his own father beaten by white men for looking at them the wrong way. When he'd joined the army, he did it knowing he'd face the same hatred in uniform. But somewhere along the way, Marcus had decided that treating others with dignity wasn't about whether they deserved it. It was about who he chose to be. And right now, looking at these terrified German women and children, he saw people who needed help. That was enough. Over the next few days, Marcus and Thomas became regular visitors to Greta's neighborhood. They brought food, medicine, and blankets. The 761st Tank Battalion, the famous Black Panthers, had been assigned to occupation duty in this sector. These were the same men who'd fought their way through France and Germany, who'd broken through enemy lines at the Battle of the Bulge, who'd liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. And now they were helping rebuild. Greta found herself looking forward to Marcus's visits. He'd started learning basic German phrases and she'd been practicing her limited English. They communicated in a mixture of both languages, with lots of hand gestures and patience. Marcus told her about his home in Alabama, about the cotton fields and the hot summers. He told her about his mother, who worked as a maid for a white family, and his younger sister, who dreamed of becoming a teacher. One afternoon, Marcus brought a photo from his pocket, a faded black and white image of a young woman with a bright smile. "That's Ruth," he said. "We're supposed to get married when I get home. If she'll still have me after all this time." Greta looked at the photo, then at Marcus. "She will," Greta said in broken English. "You are a good man. She see this." Marcus smiled, touched by her words. He looked around at the destroyed town, at the children playing in the rubble, at the women trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "Back home in Alabama, I can't eat in the same restaurant as white folks. Can't drink from the same water fountain. Have to sit in the back of the bus. But here I am, liberating the people who started this whole mess. And you're all treating me more human than my own country does." Greta didn't understand all the words, but she understood the pain in his voice. She'd heard about America's segregation, though the Nazi propaganda had twisted it to justify their own ideology. Now, seeing the reality of it in Marcus's eyes, she felt a wave of shame, not just for what her country had done, but for what she'd believed. How had she let herself become so blind? Thomas Jackson struggled more with the situation. Unlike Marcus, he couldn't easily set aside his resentment. One day, while distributing food rations, he confronted Marcus about it. "Why are you so nice to them?" he asked. "These people literally believed Hitler's lies about us. They thought we were animals. And now we're supposed to play nice and hand out chocolate?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because someone has to break the cycle. You think they're going to change their minds because we prove their propaganda right? No. The only way they learn is if we show them they were lied to. Besides, most of these folks are just trying to survive. Just like us. Just like everyone." Thomas shook his head but didn't argue further. He knew Marcus was probably right, but it didn't make it easier. That evening, something happened that would begin to change Thomas's perspective. A group of former Wehrmacht soldiers recently returned from POW camps had started causing trouble in the town. They were angry, humiliated by defeat, and looking for someone to blame. One of them, a man named Friedrich Schmidt, had been particularly vocal about his hatred for the occupying forces. Friedrich had been injured at Normandy and sent home before the war ended. He walked with a limp now, his left leg never quite healing properly. He'd been a believer in the Nazi cause, a true follower who thought Germany would create a new world order. The defeat had shattered him, and seeing black American soldiers walking through his town, handing out food to German women, treating them with respect, it made him furious. How dare they? How dare these Untermensch act as if they were equals? One evening, Friedrich and two other former soldiers confronted Thomas in the street. Thomas was alone carrying medical supplies to a house where an elderly man had fallen ill. The three Germans blocked his path, Friedrich in the front, his face twisted with rage. Thomas stopped, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "Get out of our town," Friedrich spat in German. "We don't need your help. We don't want it." Thomas didn't speak much German, but he understood the tone. He stood his ground, meeting Friedrich's eyes. The street was empty. No witnesses. Thomas could feel the tension crackling in the air. This could go very bad, very quickly. But before anyone could make a move, a voice rang out. "Stop." It was Greta. She'd been watching from her window and had run out when she saw the confrontation. She positioned herself between Thomas and the German men, her small frame somehow defiant despite her fear. "Leave him alone," she said firmly. "He's helped us. He's brought medicine and food when we had nothing. What have you done except bring shame to this town?" Friedrich's face went red. "You defend them? These are the enemy." "The war is over, Friedrich," Greta shot back. "We lost. It's done. And these men," she gestured to Thomas, "they've shown more kindness to us than our own leaders ever did. They didn't have to help us, but they did. So yes, I defend them." The two other men looked uncertain now, but Friedrich's anger hadn't diminished. He took a step toward Greta, and that's when Thomas moved. He stepped around Greta, placing himself between her and Friedrich. His hand was on his weapon now, not drawing it, but making it clear he would if necessary. In that moment, Thomas wasn't thinking about his resentment or his bitterness. He was thinking about protecting someone who'd just stood up for him. Marcus appeared from around the corner, having heard the commotion. He sized up the situation instantly and approached with his hands visible, non-threatening but alert. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Friedrich looked between Marcus and Thomas, then at Greta, who stood her ground. The other two German men were already backing away, not wanting trouble with armed American soldiers. Finally, Friedrich spat on the ground and limped away, muttering curses under his breath. The confrontation was over, but something had shifted. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the moment in her mind. She'd defended an American soldier, a black American soldier, against her own countrymen. A year ago, she would never have imagined herself doing such a thing. But a year ago, she was a different person. The propaganda had filled her head with lies, but reality had washed them away. Marcus, Thomas, and the other soldiers from the 761st had shown her through their actions who they really were. Not monsters, not savages, just men, good men, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. The next morning, Marcus came to check on Greta. He'd heard about the confrontation from Thomas. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern evident in his eyes. "Friedrich Schmidt is known to us. He's trouble. You shouldn't have put yourself at risk like that." Greta smiled softly. "You risk for us every day. Bring food, bring medicine, keep us safe. Is same thing." Marcus shook his head. "Not quite the same. We're soldiers. It's our job. You're a civilian. You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Greta said firmly. "Yes, I did. You show me truth. Nazi lie to us, say you are monster. But you are not. You are good. I must speak truth too." Marcus was quiet for a moment, moved by her words. In all his time in Germany, this was the first time someone had so directly acknowledged the propaganda and rejected it. It meant more to him than she probably knew. "Thank you," he said simply. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the American soldiers and the German civilians evolved. Trust grew slowly, like a flower pushing through concrete. Little Anna had become particularly attached to Marcus and Thomas. She'd started learning English words from them, and they'd learned German from her. The little girl had lost everything in the war, both parents killed in a bombing raid. but somehow she maintained a brightness that amazed everyone around her. One afternoon, Anna approached Thomas with a drawing she'd made. It showed stick figures holding hands, some in American uniforms, some in civilian clothes. Above them, she'd written in shaky letters, Freunde, friends. Thomas looked at the drawing for a long time, his jaw tight with emotion. He'd been so angry when he first arrived in Germany, so bitter about the injustice of it all. But this little girl, who'd been taught to fear him, had drawn him as a friend. He carefully folded the drawing and put it in his pocket. "Thank you, Anna," he said softly. "I'll keep this forever." Frau Müller, the elderly woman who'd been so suspicious at first, had also undergone a transformation. It happened gradually. She watched how Marcus treated everyone with respect. She saw how Thomas helped repair a roof on a widow's house. She noticed how the black soldiers never took advantage of their position of power, never demanded anything, never threatened. Slowly, the rigid beliefs that had been hammered into her for years began to crack. One day she approached Marcus as he was distributing rations. She stood before him, this tiny, elderly German woman looking up at this tall American soldier, and she did something that shocked everyone watching. She apologized. "I am sorry," she said in halting English. "I think bad things about you. Nazi tell lies. I believe. I am sorry." Marcus looked down at her, this woman who could have been his grandmother, and he saw the genuine remorse in her eyes. He gently took her hand. "It's okay, Frau Müller. You didn't know, but now you do. That's what matters." Tears streamed down her weathered face. She squeezed his hand, unable to say anything more. In that moment, something healed. Not completely, not perfectly, but a little bit. And sometimes, a little bit is all you need to start. Friedrich Schmidt, however, remained unchanged. He watched all of this with growing disgust. He saw German women smiling at black soldiers. He saw children playing with them. He saw his own people accepting defeat and moving forward. To Friedrich, this was betrayal of the highest order. He began planning something dark. One night, Friedrich and a small group of like-minded former soldiers decided to send a message. They planned to set fire to the building where the American soldiers stored their supplies. It would be a statement, a reminder that not all Germans accepted this occupation quietly. They moved through the darkness, carrying cans of fuel, their hearts full of misplaced rage. But someone saw them. Little Anna, who often had nightmares and wandered at night, spotted the men sneaking through the streets. She recognized Friedrich from the day he'd confronted Thomas. Scared, but brave, she ran to Greta's house and woke her up. Greta immediately understood the danger and ran to alert Marcus and Thomas. The soldiers arrived just as Friedrich was about to light the fire. A confrontation ensued, tense and dangerous. Friedrich and his men were armed with knives and makeshift weapons. Marcus called for backup, but in the meantime he tried to talk Friedrich down. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "The war is over. This won't change anything." Friedrich's eyes were wild. "You don't belong here. None of you do. This is our country." Thomas stepped forward, his voice hard. "Your country started a war that killed millions of people. Your leaders put people in camps and murdered them because of their religion or who they loved. You don't get to be angry that you lost. You're lucky the world is showing you more mercy than you showed it." The words hit Friedrich like a physical blow. He knew, deep down, that it was true. He'd seen things during the war, things he'd tried to justify or ignore. The camps, the executions, the horror. But admitting that meant admitting that everything he'd believed in was wrong, that he'd been wrong. It was too much. He dropped to his knees, the knife clattering to the ground, and he broke down, sobbing. "What have we done?" he whispered. "Oh God, what have we done?" The other men with him stood frozen, their resolve crumbling. Marcus slowly approached Friedrich and knelt beside him. "I can't answer that for you," he said quietly. "But I can tell you that you get to choose who you are from this moment forward. The past is done. You can't change it. But you can decide what kind of man you want to be tomorrow." Friedrich was arrested that night, along with his accomplices. But the incident sparked something in the town. People began talking more openly about the war, about what they'd believed, about what they'd done or failed to do. It was painful, messy, and complicated. But it was necessary. Greta organized a meeting in the town square where German civilians could ask questions of the American soldiers. She wanted to bridge the gap, to create understanding. The meeting was awkward at first. People asked difficult questions. Why are you helping us? Don't you hate us? How can you be kind after everything? Marcus answered honestly. He talked about his own experiences with racism in America. He talked about how hate only breeds more hate, and how someone has to be brave enough to break the cycle. Thomas spoke too, his words more raw and real. He admitted his struggles, his anger, his resentment. But he also talked about how little Anna's drawing had changed something in him. I realized, Thomas said, that these children didn't start this war. Most of you didn't either. You were caught in it, just like us. And if we keep treating each other like enemies, then the people who started this mess win, even in defeat. I don't want to give them that satisfaction. The crowd was silent, processing his words. Then, slowly, people began to share their own stories. A woman talked about losing her son at Stalingrad, and how she'd believed the war was righteous until she saw the devastation it brought home. A man admitted he'd been terrified when the black soldiers arrived because of what he'd been told, but that fear had been replaced with gratitude. An elderly teacher confessed that she'd taught Nazi propaganda in her classroom, and now had to live with that shame. It wasn't a moment of perfect reconciliation. There were still people in town who harbored resentment and hatred, but for many it was the beginning of healing. Greta looked at Marcus during the meeting, and he met her eyes. They shared a small smile, an acknowledgement of how far they'd come from that first terrified moment in the cellar. As summer turned to fall, orders came through that the 761st Tank Battalion would be moving to a different sector. Marcus and Thomas would be leaving. The news hit the town hard, especially Greta and little Anna. The little girl cried when she heard, clinging to Marcus's leg. "Don't go," she pleaded in German. "Stay." Marcus picked her up, holding her close. "I have to, little one, but I'll never forget you. You're the bravest girl I've ever met." Greta stood beside them, her own eyes wet with tears. She'd never expected to feel this way about an American soldier, let alone a black American soldier. But Marcus had become a friend, someone she admired and cared about deeply. The propaganda had told her men like him were monsters, but the truth was that men like Marcus had saved her life and helped her find her humanity again. On the day of their departure, the entire town gathered to see the soldiers off. It was unprecedented. German civilians lining the streets, waving goodbye to occupying forces. Frau Müller handed Marcus a small package wrapped in cloth. She'd baked bread using precious flour rations she'd saved. "For your journey," she said, "thank you for everything." Thomas received similar gifts: drawings from children, a hand-knitted scarf from an elderly woman, a carved wooden figurine from a man whose house he'd helped repair. He was overwhelmed, this young man from Detroit who'd arrived in Germany full of anger and bitterness. He'd leave with something different. Not quite peace, but maybe hope. Greta approached Marcus last. She held out a letter sealed with wax. "Give this to Ruth," she said. "Your fiancée. Tell her she is lucky woman. Tell her you are hero. Not because you fight in war, because you show kindness when you could show hate." Marcus took the letter, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say something profound, something that would capture everything he felt. But all he could manage was, "Take care of yourself, Greta, and take care of Anna. You're going to rebuild this town. I know you will." "I hope so," Greta replied. "You teach me important lesson, that people are people, that kindness is stronger than hate. I will remember, always." The trucks rolled out of town, carrying the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion to their next assignment. Marcus looked back through the rear window, watching the small German town fade into the distance. He thought about everything that had happened there, the fear, the suspicion, the gradual building of trust. He thought about how these people had expected monsters and instead found men who treated them with dignity and respect. Back in the town, Greta stood with Anna's hand in hers, watching until the trucks disappeared completely. Friedrich Schmidt, released from detention after agreeing to community service, stood at the edge of the crowd. He'd spent weeks reflecting on his choices, on his beliefs, on the man he'd become. He approached Greta hesitantly. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything." Greta looked at him. This man who'd caused so much trouble, who'd been so full of hate. But she saw something different in his eyes now. Regret. Genuine regret. "We were all wrong about many things," she replied. "The question is what we do now." Friedrich nodded. He looked around at the town, at the work that needed to be done to rebuild not just buildings but society itself. I want to help. I want to do better. Can I? Greta considered for a moment, then extended her hand. Yes, we all must do better. Together. He shook her hand, and in that simple gesture, another small victory against hatred was won. The weeks and months that followed were difficult. Germany faced years of rebuilding ahead. But in that one small town, something important had happened. People had confronted their prejudices. They'd seen beyond propaganda to the humanity of those they'd been taught to hate, and they'd been challenged to become better versions of themselves. Marcus eventually returned to Alabama and married Ruth. He told her about Greta and little Anna, about the town in Germany where, for a brief moment, people from completely different worlds had found common ground. Ruth read Greta's letter and wept, understanding that her husband had done something remarkable. He'd fought in a war, yes, but more importantly, he'd fought against hate itself, and in his own quiet way, he'd won. Thomas went back to Detroit and became a teacher, eventually joining the civil rights movement. He kept Anna's drawing in his wallet until the day he died, a reminder that children see the world more clearly than adults sometimes do. That prejudice is taught, not innate, and that if one little German girl could overcome years of propaganda to see him as a friend, then maybe, just maybe, his own country could do the same. Greta rebuilt her life in Germany. She eventually remarried, had children of her own, and lived to see Germany transform from the ruins of war into a prosperous democracy. She told her children and grandchildren about the Black American soldiers who'd treated her with kindness when they had every reason not to. She made sure they understood that hatred and prejudice are choices, and that courage means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Little Anna grew up to become a translator, specializing in English. She worked to build bridges between Germany and America, always remembering the two soldiers who'd shown her that the world was bigger and more beautiful than the narrow views she'd been taught. She named her first son Marcus and her second son Thomas. When people asked why she'd chosen American names, she told them the story of two men who'd treated her with kindness when she was an orphan in a war-torn town. The story of what happened in that small German town wasn't unique. Across post-war Germany, similar stories played out. Black American soldiers, members of segregated units, treated former enemies with dignity and respect. They shared food, provided medical care, helped rebuild, and showed compassion. It wasn't perfect. There were incidents of violence and misconduct on all sides, but there were also countless moments of genuine human connection that transcended the barriers of race, nationality, and propaganda. These soldiers returned to an America that still treated them as second-class citizens. They'd fought for freedom abroad, but couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white people at home. They'd been treated with respect by former enemies but faced discrimination from their own countrymen. The irony was bitter and painful. Yet many of them took what they'd learned, the connections they'd made, the humanity they'd witnessed, and they used it to fuel the fight for civil rights in their own country. The German women and men who'd overcome their prejudices carried those lessons forward too. They taught their children to question propaganda, to see individuals rather than stereotypes, to recognize that evil doesn't reside in skin color or nationality, but in the choices people make. Germany's reckoning with its past was long and painful, but stories like Greta's played a role in that process. Understanding that people are capable of both terrible evil and profound kindness is essential to building a better future. What happened between these Black American soldiers and German civilians challenges simplistic narratives about World War II. It shows that human beings are complex, capable of growth and change. It demonstrates that kindness is a revolutionary act, especially in the aftermath of hatred and violence, and it proves that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend compassion to someone you've been taught to fear. The title of this story asks us to consider expectations versus reality. German women expected monsters because that's what propaganda told them. What they found were men like Marcus Williams and Thomas Jackson, men who'd faced discrimination and prejudice their entire lives but chose not to perpetuate that cycle. Men who could have been harsh and cruel in their position of power, but instead chose kindness. Men who understood that breaking the cycle of hate requires someone to be brave enough to offer their hand first. This isn't a story about forgiving the unforgivable. The Holocaust happened. Millions were murdered. War crimes were committed. Those facts are immutable and must never be forgotten. But this is a story about what happens after the bombs stop falling, about how societies rebuild not just buildings but trust, not just roads but relationships. It's about the individual choices that collectively determine whether humanity moves toward more hatred or more understanding. Today, we live in a world still grappling with prejudice, still dealing with propaganda, still learning to see each other as human beings rather than categories or stereotypes. The story of Marcus, Thomas, Greta, and little Anna reminds us that change is possible, that people can overcome years of indoctrination if they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths, that extending kindness to those different from us isn't weakness, but extraordinary strength. The lesson these soldiers taught, often without realizing it, was that your character isn't defined by what you've been told to believe, but by what you choose to do. Marcus could have treated German civilians with the same contempt he'd experienced from white Americans. Thomas could have let his bitterness define his actions. But they didn't. They chose differently. And in doing so, they planted seeds of change that would grow in ways they couldn't imagine. German civilians like Greta and Frau Müller made choices too. They could have clung to their prejudices, could have refused the help, could have maintained their fear and hatred. But when confronted with the reality that contradicted the lies they'd been told, they had the courage to change their minds. That takes humility and bravery. Even Friedrich Schmidt, the former Wehrmacht soldier full of anger and resentment, eventually made a choice. He could have stayed trapped in his hatred, but he chose differently. His transformation wasn't instant or easy, but it happened because he was confronted with truth and given the opportunity to do better. This story matters because it's a blueprint for healing. In a world still fractured by hatred, prejudice, and conflict, we need examples of how people bridge divides. We need to know that it's possible, that it's been done before, that human beings are capable of extraordinary compassion even in the darkest circumstances. The black soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion and the German civilians they helped are proof of that. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and hit the like button to help others discover these important lessons from the past. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, choices, and the power we all have to make the world a little better, one act of kindness at a time.